I still remember the way my mother's voice sounded that morning, distant, distracted, as if I were just another item on her to-do list. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, clutching a cold cup of coffee, wondering how it was possible to feel invisible in your own family. Maybe you know that feeling too, the ache of being needed only when it's convenient, the silence that follows when you're the one asking for help. That was the day I realized sometimes your absence speaks louder than your presence ever could. My name is Jessica Parker, and I have always believed that life in Denver, Colorado, was meant to be lived quietly, almost invisibly, on the edges of other people's stories. At 35, I had become an expert at blending in at work, at family gatherings, even in my own apartment, where the silence was both a comfort and a reminder of how little space I seemed to occupy in the world. I worked as an accountant for a small marketing firm downtown, a place where the coffee was always burnt and the fluorescent lights hummed louder than the conversations. My days were measured in spreadsheets and deadlines. My nights in the soft glow of my laptop as I tried to stretch my modest salary far enough to cover rent, groceries, and the never-ending parade of bills that seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Capitol Hill, a neighborhood just close enough to the city's energy to feel alive, but far enough from the glossy high-rises to remind me of my place. My apartment was filled with secondhand furniture and thrift store art, each piece chosen not for style, but for price and practicality. I had learned early on that comfort was a luxury, and that security was something you built one careful decision at a time. My life was a careful balancing act, a series of small sacrifices and quiet hopes that rarely made it past the front door. Family, for me, was a complicated word. My parents had divorced when I was 12, and the split had left cracks that never quite healed. My mother remarried a man named Frank, a real estate agent with a fondness for golf and a talent for making me feel like a guest in my own childhood home. My father, on the other hand, found solace in a woman named Linda, who ran a boutique and seemed to view me as a project she could never quite finish. My younger sister, Rachel, was the family's golden child, brilliant, beautiful, and married to a successful surgeon. She lived in a sprawling house in the suburbs, her life a carefully curated collection of achievements and Instagram-worthy moments. My older brother, Ben, was the opposite, charming but aimless, drifting from job to job and relationship to relationship, always one step away from disaster. Then there was Aunt May, my mother's younger sister, who taught elementary school and lived in a tiny apartment filled with books and plants. She was the only person in my family who seemed to see me, really see me, without judgment or expectation. And finally, there was my cousin Olivia, Aunt Linda's daughter, who had inherited her mother's sharp tongue and her father's bank account. Olivia never missed an opportunity to remind me of the distance between our lives. Her words always wrapped in a veneer of concern that felt more like condescension. Over the years, I had become the family's unofficial safety net. When Ben needed money for rent or to cover a bad decision, he called me. When Rachel's wedding costs spiraled out of control, I put the charges on my credit card, promising myself that she would pay me back, even as I knew she wouldn't. When my father's car broke down, I sent what I could, only to see photos of him and Linda vacationing in Napa a month later. Each time, I told myself that this was what family did, that my willingness to help would eventually be repaid in kindness or gratitude. But the truth was, the more I gave, the more invisible I felt. My generosity became an expectation, my needs an afterthought. I learned to swallow my resentment, to smile through the disappointment, to tell myself that things would be different next time. My days followed a predictable rhythm. I woke up at 6, made coffee in a chipped mug, and watched the sun rise over the city as I mentally calculated which bills could wait another week. I clipped coupons, compared prices, and knew exactly which grocery store had the best deal on everything from toilet paper to coffee. My car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic, rattled ominously every time it rained, but I couldn't afford to replace it. I had mastered the art of appearing perfectly fine while constantly calculating costs in my head, wondering if I could say yes to an invitation, or if I needed to invent an excuse to stay home. My life was ordinary, sometimes difficult, occasionally lonely, but stable in its own way. I had learned to find comfort in routine, to take pride in my ability to survive, even if thriving felt out of reach. Birthdays had never been a big deal in my family, and my 35th was no exception. I spent the day at work, fielding half-hearted congratulations from coworkers who barely remembered my name. That evening, I stopped at the corner market on my way home, a ritual I had kept for years. Every Friday, I bought a lottery ticket, just one, never more telling myself it was a harmless indulgence, a small act of hope in a life that rarely offered surprises. My family loved to tease me about it. My mother called it a tax on people who couldn't do math. Ben joked that I should just give him the money instead. Rachel rolled her eyes and told me to invest in something real. But there was something about those tickets, about the possibility of escape, that I couldn't let go of. Even as the years passed, and my winnings never amounted to more than a free ticket or a few dollars. That night, I bought my ticket as usual, choosing numbers that meant something to me my birthday. Rachel's, Aunt May's, even Ben's. Despite everything, I went home, ordered takeout from the Thai place down the street, and opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. I didn't expect anything, I never did. The lottery drawing was at 8, but I barely paid attention, scrolling through social media and watching other people celebrate their lives in ways that felt impossibly distant from mine. It wasn't until almost 9 that I remembered the ticket, pulling it from my purse with a sigh, already preparing myself for disappointment. The first number matched. I smiled, a little thrill running through me. The second matched, then the third. My heart started to race. By the time I reached the sixth and final number, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the ticket. I checked the numbers again, then again, convinced I had made a mistake. I turned on the television, rewound the live drawing, and watched as each of my numbers appeared on the screen, one after another. I sat there in stunned silence, the room suddenly too small, too bright, too real. According to the lottery website, I was the sole winner of $52 million. I didn't sleep that night. I paced my apartment, the ticket clutched in my hand, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. I thought about all the things I could do, all the ways my life could change. And then I thought about all the stories I had read about people whose lives had been ruined by sudden wealth, families torn apart by greed, friendships destroyed by jealousy, winners who ended up worse off than before. I read article after article, each one a cautionary tale, each one a warning. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision I would tell no one. Not my family, not my friends, not even Aunt May. At least not yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what this money would mean for me before anyone else tried to tell me what to do with it. In the quiet hours of that morning, as the city slowly came to life outside my window, I realized that everything had changed and that, for the first time in my life, I was the only one who knew. The morning after I realized I was a multimillionaire, the world outside my window looked exactly the same. But I felt as if I had stepped into a parallel universe. The city was waking up, cars humming down the street, neighbors walking their dogs, the distant sound of a train rolling through downtown Denver. I watched it all from behind my curtains, clutching the lottery ticket as if it might vanish if I let go. I knew I couldn't keep it in my apartment forever, and I certainly couldn't just walk into a convenience store and claim my winnings like I was cashing in a coupon. I needed help, and not the kind of help I could ask from anyone in my family. I spent the next few hours researching everything I could about lottery winners, how they claimed their prizes, how they protected themselves, how they lost everything. The stories were a mix of cautionary tales and outright horror, people hounded by relatives, friends, and strangers, lawsuits from acquaintances who suddenly remembered old debts, marriages and families torn apart by suspicion and greed. I read about people who had gone bankrupt within a few years, who had been robbed, who had ended up lonelier than before. The more I read, the more I realized that the money was both a blessing and a curse, and that the only way to survive it was to be smarter than the stories I was reading. I made an appointment with a financial attorney named Richard Anderson, whose name I found on a list of professionals recommended for lottery winners. His office was in a glass tower downtown, the kind of place I usually pass by without a second glance. I arrived early, my heart pounding, the ticket zipped into a hidden pocket in my purse. The receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile, and I sat in the waiting area, trying to look like someone who belonged there. When Mr. Anderson called my name, I followed him into a corner office with a view of the city, the mountains rising in the distance like a promise. He was a calm, methodical man, with silver hair and a voice that made everything sound reasonable. I handed him the ticket, my hands trembling, and he examined it with the care of a surgeon. He asked me a series of questions: how I had acquired it, whether anyone else knew, what my plans were. I told him the truth that I hadn't told a soul, that I was terrified, that I didn't want this money to ruin my life. He nodded, as if he had heard it all before, and began to outline my options. He explained that in Colorado, I could claim the prize through a trust, which would allow me to keep my name out of the public record. He recommended setting up a blind trust, with him as the trustee, so that my identity would be shielded from anyone who might go looking for the winner. He talked about taxes, about investments, about assembling a team of advisors who would help me manage the money responsibly. He warned me, gently but firmly, that the biggest mistake lottery winners made was telling too many people too soon. Once the secret was out, there was no putting it back. I listened, taking notes, my mind spinning with the weight of it all. It felt surreal, sitting in that office, talking about millions of dollars as if it were just another line item in a budget. Mr. Anderson was efficient, but not unkind. He told me that the first thing I needed to do was to sign the ticket and lock it in a safe deposit box at the bank. He would handle the paperwork, the trust, the claims process. I would need to meet with a tax advisor, an investment manager, and an estate planner. It was a process, he assured me, but one that would protect me in the long run. When I left his office, I felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. I had a plan, a path forward, but I also had a secret that was growing larger by the hour. I went to the bank, opened a safe deposit box, and placed the ticket inside, my hands shaking as I closed the metal door. I walked out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness, and realized that I was now living two lives. On the outside, I was still Jessica Parker, the struggling accountant with a 10-year-old car and a closet full of thrift store clothes. On the inside, I was a millionaire, with a future that was suddenly wide open and terrifying. The days that followed were a blur of meetings and paperwork. I met with Mr. Anderson again, this time with a tax advisor named Miss Patel, who explained the realities of federal and state taxes, the importance of charitable giving, and the need to plan for the future. I sat in conference rooms with people who spoke in numbers and percentages, who treated my windfall as a puzzle to be solved rather than a miracle. I signed documents, opened accounts, and listened to advice about living below my means, about not making any sudden changes, about keeping my story straight. I learned how to say no, how to deflect questions, how to keep my emotions in check. At work, nothing changed. I still arrived early, stayed late, and did my best to avoid the office politics that swirled around me. My coworkers had no idea that anything was different. I still brought my lunch in a brown paper bag, still worried about the price of gas, still clipped coupons and compared prices at the grocery store. I was careful not to let anything slip, not to give anyone a reason to look at me differently. I told myself that I was protecting myself, that I was doing the right thing, but the truth was that the secret was starting to weigh on me. I found myself watching the people around me more closely. I wondered what they would do if they knew. Would they treat me differently? Would they ask for favors, for loans, for gifts? Would they resent me, envy me, or simply disappear? I thought about my family, about all the times I had helped them, about all the times I had been the one to pick up the pieces. I wondered if they would be happy for me, or if they would see me as a resource, a solution to their problems. The questions circled in my mind, growing louder with each passing day. I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to share the news, to celebrate, to laugh and dream and plan. But every time I picked up the phone, I remembered the stories I had read, the warnings I had heard. I remembered the look in Mr. Anderson's eyes when he told me that secrets were easier to keep than to reclaim. I thought about Aunt May, about how she would smile and hug me and tell me that I deserved every bit of happiness. I thought about Rachel, about how she would calculate what she could ask for, about Ben, who would see the money as a lifeline. I thought about my parents, about the way they had always measured love in dollars and cents. The loneliness crept in slowly, like a fog. I went through the motions of my life, but everything felt muted, distant, as if I were watching myself from the outside. I stopped answering calls from my family, afraid that I would slip and say something I couldn't take back. I avoided invitations, made excuses, retreated into the safety of my apartment. I told myself that it was temporary, that I just needed time to adjust. But the truth was that I was afraid of what the money would do to me, to the people I loved, to the fragile balance I had built. I started to question everything. Had my family ever really cared about me, or had I simply been useful? Was my generosity a choice or an obligation? Would they have helped me if the roles were reversed, or would they have turned away, as they so often did when I needed something? The doubts gnawed at me, eroding the foundation of trust I had tried so hard to maintain. I replayed old conversations in my mind, searching for signs, for clues, for proof that I mattered beyond what I could give. The secret became a wall between me and the rest of the world. I carried it with me everywhere, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. I tried to distract myself with work, with errands, with the routines that had once brought me comfort. But nothing felt the same. The money had changed everything, even as I tried to pretend that nothing had changed at all. There were moments when I caught myself dreaming of travel, of a new car, of a home that felt like mine. But the dreams were always tinged with guilt, with fear, with the knowledge that any change would be noticed, questioned, dissected. I was trapped by my own good fortune, unable to move forward, unable to go back. I missed the simplicity of my old life, the predictability, the small joys that came from making ends meet. I missed the feeling of belonging, of being a part of something. Even if that something was flawed, I missed the comfort of knowing who I was, even if who I was had never felt like enough. In the quiet of my apartment, I began to realize that the money had not solved my problems. It had simply given them new shapes, new names, new shadows. I was still alone, still searching for connection, still longing for a sense of home. The difference was that now, I had the means to change everything and no idea where to begin. The days blurred together as I tried to settle into my new reality, but the secret I carried only grew heavier. I found myself drifting through my routines, haunted by the knowledge that I could change everything in an instant, yet paralyzed by the fear of what that change might bring. I had always believed that money was the answer to my problems, but now that I had it hidden, protected, and untouched, I realized that the real challenge was not how to spend it, but how to live with it. The loneliness that had crept in after my windfall had become a constant companion, and I began to wonder if I would ever feel truly seen or understood again. It was during one of those restless nights, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, that the idea first took root. I kept replaying old conversations with my family, searching for moments of genuine care, but all I could remember were the times I had been the one to give, the one to rescue, the one to sacrifice. I wondered if the people I loved would ever do the same for me, or if I was only valuable to them when I was useful. The question gnawed at me, refusing to let go, until it became something I could no longer ignore. I decided to test them not out of spite, but out of a desperate need for clarity. I needed to know, once and for all, who would stand by me if I had nothing left to give. The plan formed slowly, taking shape in the quiet hours of the night. I would tell my family that I had lost my job, that I was struggling to pay my rent and medical bills, and that I needed help. I would ask each of them for a loan $6,000, enough to be significant but not impossible. I wanted to see who would step up, who would offer support, and who would turn away. I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I reached out to Sophie, my oldest friend and the only person I trusted with the truth. Sophie and I had met in college, and over the years, she had become my confidant, my sounding board, and my anchor. She was the one person who had never asked me for anything, who had always listened without judgment, and who had seen me at my best and my worst. I invited her over one evening, and as we sat in my living room, I told her everything about the lottery, about the trust, about the secret I was struggling to keep. Sophie listened quietly, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're not wrong to want to know," she said softly, "but you have to be prepared for the answers." I nodded, feeling both comforted and terrified. Together, we crafted the story I would tell my family that my company had downsized, that I had been let go with little notice, that my savings had been wiped out by unexpected medical expenses. We rehearsed the details, making sure the story was believable but not dramatic, urgent but not desperate. Sophie helped me practice my tone, my pauses, my explanations, until I felt ready to face the people who had shaped my life. The first call I made was to my mother. I waited until a Sunday afternoon, when I knew she would be home, and dialed her number with trembling hands. As the phone rang, I rehearsed my lines in my head, trying to keep my voice steady. When she answered, I launched into the story, explaining how I had lost my job, how the bills were piling up, how I was doing everything I could to find work, but needed help to get through the next month. I asked her if she could lend me $6,000, promising to pay her back as soon as I was able. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear her breathing, the faint sound of the television in the background. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with concern, but also with something else: hesitation. Maybe, or calculation. She told me that things were tight, that Frank's business had been slow, that they had just put a down payment on a new car. She asked if I had tried unemployment, if I'd reached out to my father, if there was any way I could cut back on expenses. She said she would talk to Frank and see what they could do, but she couldn't make any promises. I thanked her, my heart sinking, and hung up the phone. Next, I called my father. He answered on the second ring, his voice brisk and businesslike. I repeated the story, careful to keep my tone even, and asked if he could help. He listened without interrupting, then launched into a lecture about financial responsibility, about the importance of having a safety net, about how he had warned me that this could happen. He told me that he and Linda were saving for retirement, that they couldn't afford to dip into their accounts, that I needed to learn to stand on my own 2 feet. He offered advice, but no money, and ended the call with a reminder to be smart about your choices. I sat in silence for a long time after that call, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I had expected disappointment, but the reality was sharper than I had imagined. I wondered if he had ever truly seen me as anything other than a responsibility, a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be loved. I moved on to Rachel, my sister. I texted her first, knowing that she was always busy, and asked if she had a few minutes to talk. She called me back that evening, her voice bright and cheerful, full of stories about her kids and her latest home renovation project. When I told her what had happened, her tone shifted sympathetic, but distant. She told me that things were tight, that the kids' tuition was due, that they had just finished remodeling the kitchen. She said she wished she could help, but Paul handled the finances, and he was very strict about their budget. She offered to let me stay in their guest room if things got really bad, but made it clear that money was out of the question. Ben was next. I debated whether to call or text, knowing that he was unpredictable at the best of times. I decided to call, and after a few rings, he picked up, sounding groggy and distracted. I told him my story, and he listened in silence. When I finished, he sighed and told me that he was barely scraping by himself, that he had just lost his job, that he was behind on rent. He said he wished he could help, but he was in no position to do so. He promised to call me back if things changed, but I knew he wouldn't. By the time I finished with my immediate family, I felt hollowed out, as if I had been emptied of hope. I knew, deep down, that their responses were not a surprise, but the confirmation stung all the same. I had always been the one to step in, to offer help, to make sacrifices, but when the roles were reversed, there was nothing for me. I turned to Aunt May, the one person in my family who had never asked for anything, who had always given freely of her time and her love. I called her on a quiet evening, my voice trembling as I told her my story. She listened without interrupting, her concern genuine and immediate. When I finished, she told me that she didn't have much, but she would do whatever she could to help. She offered to lend me what she had, $3,000, and insisted that I could stay with her if I needed to. Her generosity brought tears to my eyes, and I realized, in that moment, that she was the only person who had ever truly seen me. I reached out to Aunt Linda next, knowing that her response would be different. She answered my call with her usual briskness, and when I told her my story, she listened politely before launching into a monologue about the importance of planning for the future. She told me that she and her husband had worked hard for everything they had, that they couldn't afford to bail out every family member who ran into trouble. She suggested that I look for a roommate, that I downsize my apartment, that I consider moving to a cheaper city. She wished me luck and ended the call. Finally! I contacted Tom, an old friend from college who had once been close but had drifted away over the years. I hesitated before reaching out, unsure if he would even respond. But, to my surprise, he called me back within an hour. I told him my story, and he listened quietly, asking a few questions but offering no judgment. He told me that he was sorry for what I was going through, that he wished he could help, but that things were tight for him as well. He offered to meet for coffee, to talk, to catch up, but made it clear that money was not an option. As I worked my way through the list of people who had shaped my life, I realized that the pattern was always the same: concern, sympathy, advice, but no real help. Only Aunt May had offered anything tangible. And even then, it was more than she could afford. The rest of my family, the people I had supported and sacrificed for, had nothing to give me when I needed them most. The experiment left me feeling exposed, raw, and strangely liberated. I had always suspected that my relationships were built on uneven ground, but now I had proof. I could no longer pretend that things would change, that my generosity would be repaid, that I was anything more than a resource to the people I loved. The knowledge was painful, but it was also freeing. I no longer had to wonder where I stood, no longer had to hope for something that would never come. In the days that followed, I withdrew even further into myself. I stopped answering calls, stopped responding to texts, stopped pretending that everything was fine. I spent long hours walking through the city, letting the noise and the movement wash over me, searching for a sense of belonging that had always eluded me. I thought about the money, about the possibilities it offered, about the life I could build if I let go of the past. I thought about Aunt May, about her kindness, about the way she had always made me feel seen. I realized that the test I had set for my family was not just about money. It was about love, about loyalty, about the ties that bind us together. I had spent my whole life trying to earn my place, trying to prove my worth, trying to be enough. But in the end, The only person who had ever truly valued me was the one who had the least to give. The experience changed me in ways I couldn't have predicted. I began to see my family not as a source of comfort, but as a collection of individuals, each with their own needs, their own limitations, their own stories. I stopped expecting them to be something they were not, stopped hoping for a connection that would never come. I started to imagine a different kind of life, a life built on honesty, on self-respect, on the knowledge that I was enough, with or without their approval. The money was still there, waiting, a promise and a burden. But for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. I knew that I could choose my own path, that I could build a life that reflected my values, my dreams, my worth. I knew that I could be generous without being used, that I could love without losing myself. As I sat in my apartment, the city lights flickering outside my window, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. I had faced the truth, and I had survived. I was still standing, still dreaming, still hoping for something more. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that it was possible. The days after my experiment with my family passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I felt both lighter and lonelier, as if I had finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for years, only to realize how much of my identity had been tied to the act of carrying it. I moved through my routines with a new sense of detachment, watching myself from a distance, as if I were a character in someone else's story. The city outside my window was waking up to spring, the air warming, the trees along the sidewalks beginning to bud. But I felt unchanged, still caught in the same cycle of questions and doubts that had haunted me since the day I learned I was a millionaire. I tried to focus on the practicalities of my new life. On the steps Mr. Anderson and his team had laid out for me, I met with my advisors, reviewed investment portfolios, signed documents, and listened to their careful, measured advice about how to move forward. I kept my spending habits the same, resisted the urge to make any sudden changes, and told myself that I was doing the right thing by keeping my secret. But the truth was, the secret had become a living thing, growing larger and more unwieldy with every passing day. I found myself jumping at shadows, second-guessing every word I said, every purchase I made, every interaction with the people around me. It was during this uneasy lull that I first noticed something strange. Aunt Linda, who had always been distant and self-absorbed, began reaching out to me more often. At first, it was just a few texts, questions about how I was doing, whether I had found a new job, if I needed anything. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to her words, a kind of forced warmth that felt out of place. I tried to respond with the same careful distance, keeping my answers vague and noncommittal, but she persisted, calling me at odd hours, inviting me to lunch, asking about my plans for the future. I told myself that she was just being nosy, that she had heard about my supposed financial troubles and wanted to satisfy her curiosity. But as the days went on, her questions became more pointed. She asked about my apartment, about my car, about whether I had considered moving to a cheaper neighborhood. She wanted to know if I had applied for certain jobs, if I had reached out to old friends for help, if I was planning to sell any of my belongings. The more she pressed, the more uneasy I became. I started to wonder if she knew something, if she had heard a rumor, if someone had let something slip. One afternoon, as I was leaving my building, I noticed a car parked across the street, its engine idling, the driver's face obscured by sunglasses and a baseball cap. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, the car was there again the next day, and the day after that. I started to change my routines, taking different routes to work, leaving at different times, watching for signs that I was being followed. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Aunt Linda's calls became more frequent. her questions more insistent. She asked if I had come into any money, if I had received an inheritance, if I had won anything. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had heard a rumor about someone in the family coming into a large sum of money, and wondered if I knew anything about it. I laughed it off, told her I wished it were true. But inside I was panicking. I wondered who had started the rumor, how much they knew, what they were hoping to find. The pressure mounted with each passing day. I found myself scrutinizing every interaction, every conversation, every glance from a neighbor or coworker. I worried that I had been careless, that I had let something slip, that someone had seen me at the bank or overheard a conversation. I became hypervigilant, checking my phone for signs of surveillance, scanning my email for suspicious messages, watching for strangers who lingered too long in the lobby of my building. The secret that had once felt like a shield now felt like a target, and I was terrified of what would happen if it was discovered. I tried to confide in Sophie, but even with her, I found myself holding back, afraid that the more people who knew, the greater the risk. I became withdrawn, avoiding social gatherings, declining invitations, retreating into the safety of my apartment. I told myself that it was temporary, that I just needed to wait out the storm. But the anxiety was relentless, a constant hum beneath the surface of my days. It was during this time of heightened tension that the second crisis struck, shattering the fragile equilibrium I had managed to maintain. I was at work, reviewing a set of quarterly reports, when my phone buzzed with a call from Rachel's husband, Paul. He never called me directly, and the sight of his name on my screen sent a jolt of fear through me. I answered, my voice tight with apprehension, and listened as he explained, in a voice strained with worry, that Rachel had been in a car accident. She was in the hospital, in surgery, and they weren't sure if she would be okay. The world seemed to tilt beneath me as I listened to the details: how she had been driving home from the kids' school, how another car had run a red light, how the impact had left her with multiple injuries. Paul's voice broke as he explained that the insurance would only cover so much, that the hospital bills were already mounting, that they didn't know how they were going to pay for the surgery she needed. He asked if I could come to the hospital, if I could help with the kids, if I could do anything. I left work without a word, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I drove to the hospital in a daze, barely aware of the traffic, the city, the world outside my car. When I arrived, I found Paul in the waiting room, his face drawn and pale, his hands shaking. The kids were with a neighbor, he explained, and he was trying to hold it together for their sake. He told me that the doctors were hopeful, but that Rachel would need another surgery, and that the cost was more than they could afford. As I sat with him, listening to the litany of expenses, deductibles, co-pays, out-of-network specialists, I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. I had the means to help, to make the problem disappear with a single phone call. But I was trapped by my own secret, by the fear of what would happen if I revealed the truth. I thought about the experiment I had run, about the disappointment I had felt when my family had failed to help me. And I wondered if I was any better, if I was now the one turning away when someone needed me. The hours dragged on, the waiting room filling and emptying as families came and went. I watched Paul pace the floor, watched the worry etch deeper lines into his face, watched the hope flicker and fade with each update from the doctors. I wanted to help, to reach out, to offer the money that would save Rachel. But I was paralyzed by indecision, by the knowledge that any sudden generosity would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. I left the hospital late that night, my mind in turmoil. I drove through the city, the streets empty and silent, the lights blurring past in a haze. I thought about all the times I had wished for a chance to change my life, all the times I had dreamed of being able to help the people I loved. Now that I had the power, I was afraid to use it, afraid of what it would cost me, afraid of what it would reveal. The next morning, I woke to a flurry of messages from my family. My mother wanted updates on Rachel's condition. My father offered advice about doctors and treatments. Aunt Linda sent a terse message about the importance of having good insurance. No one mentioned the cost, but I could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air: who was going to pay for all of this? I knew that if I offered to cover the bills, the secret I had worked so hard to protect would be at risk. But if I did nothing, I would have to live with the knowledge that I had let my sister suffer when I could have helped. I spent the day in a fog, unable to focus on anything but the choice before me. I weighed the risks, the consequences, the possible outcomes. I imagined the questions, the suspicions, the accusations that would follow if I suddenly produced the money. I imagined the relief, the gratitude, the possibility of forgiveness if I did nothing. I thought about Aunt May, about her quiet generosity, about the way she had given without expectation. And I wondered if I was capable of the same. As the sun set, painting the city in shades of gold and pink, I made my decision. I called Mr. Anderson and asked him to arrange an anonymous payment to the hospital, enough to cover Rachel's surgery and the bills that would follow. I told him to make it look like a grant, a gift from a charitable foundation, something that would not be traced back to me. He agreed, his voice calm and reassuring, and promised to handle the details. That night, I slept for the first time in days, the weight of the decision lifting from my shoulders. I knew that I had done the right thing, even if no one would ever know. I had chosen to help, to give without expectation, to be the person I wanted to be. The secret was still there, still heavy, still dangerous. But for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. The weeks after Rachel's recovery passed in a gentle blur, the city shifting from the hopeful green of early summer to the deeper, more settled warmth of July. I found myself moving through the days with a new steadiness, as if the act of helping my sister quietly, anonymously, had anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. The secret was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight I had to carry alone. Instead, it had become a quiet source of strength, a reminder that I could choose how to use what I'd been given, and that I could do so on my own terms. Yet, even as I found a new rhythm, I felt a growing need to share the truth with someone who truly mattered. I thought often of Aunt May, the only person who had offered help when I needed it, the only one who had never asked for anything in return. Her kindness had always been a constant in my life, a quiet presence that made the world feel less lonely. I realized that I wanted her to know not just about the money, but about everything I had been through, the choices I had made, and the person I was becoming. One Saturday afternoon, I called Aunt May and invited her over for tea. She arrived with a small bouquet of wildflowers and a smile that made me feel, for the first time in months, like I was truly home. We sat together in my living room, the windows open to let in the summer breeze, and I poured us each a cup of tea. For a while, we talked about ordinary things or students, the latest book she was reading, the way the city seemed to come alive in the summer. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tension building, the words I needed to say gathering like a storm. Finally, I set my cup down and looked at her, my hands trembling just a little. "Aunt May," I began, my voice softer than I intended. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been carrying for a long time." She listened, her eyes kind and steady, as I told her everything: the lottery ticket, the meetings with Mr. Anderson, the trust, the secret I had kept from everyone. I told her about the experiment with my family, about the disappointment and the relief, about the way her offer of help had meant more to me than she could ever know. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift from surprise to understanding, and finally to a quiet pride. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand in hers. "Jessica," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm so proud of you. Not because you won the lottery, but because you've managed to stay true to yourself through all of this. Money can change people, but it doesn't have to change who you are inside. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, a mix of relief and gratitude washing over me. For the first time, I allowed myself to cry not out of fear or frustration, but out of the simple joy of being seen and accepted. Aunt May squeezed my hand, her own eyes shining. "You have a good heart," she said. "Don't let anyone or anything take that away from you. Use what you have to build the life you want, not the life others expect from you. And remember, you don't owe anyone an explanation for your happiness." We sat together in silence for a while. The weight of the secret finally lifted. I told her about my plans, how I wanted to use some of the money to help others, how I dreamed of starting a foundation to support people like her, people who gave so much and asked for so little. She listened, nodding, her pride in me clear. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "But promise me you'll take care of yourself, too. You deserve happiness. Jessica, don't forget that." That evening, after Aunt May left, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The secret was no longer mine alone, and in sharing it with her, I had found a new sense of purpose. I realized that the money was not a curse, nor was it a solution to all my problems. It was simply a tool, one that I could use to shape my life, to help others, and to honor the values that Aunt May had taught me. With that clarity, I knew it was time to face my family. I had spent so long hiding, so long pretending, that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to speak my truth. But I was ready now not to reveal the secret of my fortune, but to set boundaries, to reclaim my sense of self, and to let go of the need for their approval. I decided to invite everyone over for dinner, a rare gathering. Given the distance and the busy lives we all led, I spent the day preparing, cooking simple dishes that reminded me of childhood, setting the table with care. As the evening approached, I felt a familiar anxiety rising, but I reminded myself that I was no longer the person who needed to be everything to everyone. My mother arrived first, her eyes scanning the apartment as if searching for signs of change. Frank followed, making polite conversation about the traffic and the weather. Rachel and Paul came next, Rachel moving a little more slowly than usual, but smiling, her recovery evident in the way she carried herself. Ben arrived late, as always, his energy restless and unfocused. Aunt Linda swept in with her usual air of authority, her husband in tow. And finally, Aunt May arrived, her presence a quiet anchor in the midst of the chaos. We ate together, the conversation polite but strained, everyone careful not to mention the recent crisis or the mysterious donor who had paid Rachel's bills. I watched them all, seeing them clearly for the first time, not as the family I wished I had, but as the people they truly were, with their strengths and their flaws, their kindness and their limitations. After dinner, I stood and cleared my throat, the room falling silent. "I wanted to thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady. "I know it's been a difficult few months, and I appreciate you being here." I paused, searching for the right words. I also wanted to talk about something that's been weighing on me for a long time. I told them about the challenges I had faced after losing my job, about the fear and uncertainty, about the way I had reached out for help. I didn't mention the experiment or the specifics of who had offered what. But I spoke honestly about how it had felt to be on the other side, to need support, and to find that it wasn't always there. I told them that I understood everyone had their own struggles, their own reasons, but that the experience had changed me. "I've realized," I said, "that I can't keep giving more than I have. I can't keep trying to earn love or approval by sacrificing my own well-being. I need to set some boundaries, for my own sake." I looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. I'm grateful for the family I have, but I need to start living my life on my own terms. That means saying no sometimes, and it means asking for respect. There was a long silence, the kind that feels heavy with unspoken words. My mother looked away, her expression unreadable. Rachel nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Ben shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. Aunt Linda pursed her lips, clearly wanting to say something but holding back. Only Aunt May smiled, her support unwavering. "I'm not asking for anything," I continued. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'm okay now. I found a way through, thanks to the help of someone who truly cares. I hope we can move forward with more honesty, more respect, and less expectation." The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary. There were questions, some defensiveness, a few attempts to justify past actions. But I held my ground, refusing to be drawn into old patterns. I didn't reveal my secret, didn't offer explanations or apologies. I simply stated my truth and let it stand. When the evening ended and everyone had gone, I felt a sense of relief, as if I had finally closed a chapter that had been open for far too long. I knew that things wouldn't change overnight, that my family would still be who they were. But I also knew that I had changed. I was no longer defined by their expectations, no longer trapped by the need to please. I had found my voice, and with it, a new sense of freedom. In the quiet that followed, I sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on, one by one. I thought about Aunt May, about her wisdom and her love, about the way she had always believed in me. I thought about the journey I had taken, the choices I had made, the person I was becoming, and for the first time, I felt truly at peace with my family, with my past, and most importantly, with myself. The weeks after that family dinner felt like the slow, gentle turning of a page. I found myself waking up each morning with a sense of lightness I hadn't known in years, as if the air itself had changed. The city was deep in the heart of summer, the days long and golden, the evenings soft and full of possibility. I walked through my neighborhood with a new sense of belonging, no longer weighed down by secrets or the need to prove myself. For the first time, I was living for myself, not for the expectations or judgments of others. It didn't happen all at once, of course. Change rarely does. But as the days passed, I began to imagine a different kind of future, one shaped not by fear or obligation, but by hope and intention. I realized that I no longer wanted to spend my life behind a desk, counting other people's money, worrying about deadlines and office politics. I wanted to do something that mattered, something that reflected the lessons I had learned and the values I held close. The idea came to me one afternoon as I sat with Aunt May in her tiny apartment, sunlight streaming through the windows, the air filled with the scent of her favorite tea. We talked about her students, about the loneliness she sometimes saw in the eyes of the older people in her building, about the way so many were forgotten by their families, left to navigate the world alone. I thought about all the times I had felt invisible, all the times I had longed for someone to see me, to care, to reach out. I realized that I wanted to be that person for others, to offer the kind of kindness and support that Aunt May had always given me, with her encouragement. I began the process of leaving my job. It was both terrifying and exhilarating to hand in my resignation, to step away from the security of a steady paycheck and into the unknown. My boss was surprised, but not devastated. I had always been reliable, but never indispensable. I packed up my desk, said my goodbyes, and walked out of the office for the last time, feeling a sense of freedom that was almost dizzying. I spent the next few months working with Mr. Anderson and a small team of advisors to establish a charitable foundation. We called it the May Foundation, in honor of the woman who had taught me the true meaning of generosity. Our mission was simple: to support elderly people living alone, to provide companionship, practical assistance, and a sense of community for those who had been overlooked or abandoned by their families. We started small, organizing weekly visits, helping with groceries and errands, offering rides to doctor's appointments. But as word spread, the foundation grew, attracting volunteers and donations from across the city. I threw myself into the work, finding joy in the simple act of showing up for others. I visited nursing homes and community centers, listened to stories of loss and resilience, laughed and cried with people who had spent too long in silence. I saw firsthand how a single act of kindness could change a life, how a phone call or a shared meal could bring light to even the darkest days. The work was exhausting at times, but it filled me with a sense of purpose I had never known in my years as an accountant. With the foundation established, I turned my attention to building a new home for myself and Aunt May. We found a small house on a quiet street, not far from the park where we used to walk together on Sunday afternoons. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was warm and welcoming, filled with sunlight and laughter. I decorated it with thrift store finds and family photos, filling the rooms with memories and hope. Aunt May moved in with me, her presence a constant source of comfort and joy. We settled into a gentle routine: morning coffee on the porch, afternoons spent reading or gardening, evenings filled with conversation and quiet companionship. Life was simple, but it was rich in ways I had never imagined. I no longer worried about money, about bills or emergencies or the future. I had enough, and that was all I needed. I found happiness in the small things: a blooming rosebush, a letter from a grateful family, the sound of Aunt May's laughter echoing through the house. I learned to let go of the need for approval, to trust my own instincts, to believe that I was worthy of love and belonging just as I was. My relationship with my family changed, too. I kept in touch with them, but the old patterns of obligation and resentment faded away. I called my mother on her birthday, sent cards to Rachel's children, met Ben for coffee when he was in town. Our conversations were polite, sometimes even warm. But I no longer felt the need to explain myself or to seek their validation. I accepted them for who they were, and in doing so, I found a measure of peace I had never known before. There were times when members of my family faced real hardship: a job loss, an illness, a sudden expense they couldn't cover. When that happened, I found ways to help, always anonymously, always without expectation. I paid a medical bill here, covered a month's rent there, sent a grocery delivery when I knew someone was struggling. I did it not out of obligation, but out of compassion, out of a desire to give without strings attached. It was a quiet kind of generosity, one that brought me more satisfaction than any public recognition ever could. I watched as my family slowly adjusted to the new boundaries I had set. Some of them grew distant, unsure how to relate to me now that I was no longer the one they could rely on for everything. Others found their own strength, learning to solve their problems without turning to me for rescue. Aunt May remained my closest confidant, her wisdom and kindness a guiding light in my life. Together, we built a community of friends and neighbors, people who supported and cared for one another, who understood that family could be chosen as well as inherited. As the years passed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who believed she had to earn love, who gave until she had nothing left, who hid her pain behind a mask of competence and self-sufficiency. I thought about the woman I had become: strong, independent, compassionate, unafraid to set boundaries and to claim her own happiness. I realized that the greatest gift the lottery had given me was not financial security, but the freedom to choose my own path, to define my own worth, to live a life that was true to my values. I no longer felt the need to keep my story a secret, but I also saw no reason to broadcast it. The people who mattered most knew the truth, and that was enough. I continued to work with the foundation, to build relationships, to offer support and encouragement to those who needed it most. I found joy in the act of giving, in the knowledge that I was making a difference, however small, in the lives of others. In the quiet moments sitting on the porch with Aunt May, walking through the park at dusk, listening to the laughter of children playing in the yard, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I had learned that happiness was not something to be chased or earned, but something to be cultivated, nurtured, and shared. I had learned that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in the quality of our relationships, in the kindness we offer, in the peace we find within ourselves. Looking back, I saw how far I had come, how much I had grown, how many times I had stumbled and found my way again. I was grateful for every lesson, every heartbreak, every moment of doubt and fear. They had shaped me, strengthened me, prepared me for the life I was now living. As I watched the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I felt a quiet sense of pride. I had built a life that was my own, a life filled with meaning and connection, a life that honored the people who had helped me along the way. I knew that there would be challenges ahead, that the future was uncertain, but I also knew that I was ready to face whatever came next. In the end, I understood that the true value of my journey was not in the money I had won, but in the freedom it had given me the freedom to choose, to give, to love, and to live on my own terms. I had found peace, not in the approval of others, but in the quiet certainty that I was enough, just as I was. And that, I realized, was the greatest prize of all. As the seasons changed and the years quietly slipped by, I found myself reflecting more often on the journey that had brought me here. There were moments when I would sit on the porch with Aunt May, watching the world go by, and marvel at how much my life had transformed, not just on the outside, but deep within. I had learned to let go of the need for validation, to stop measuring my worth by what I could give or how much I was needed. I had learned to say no, to set boundaries, to protect my peace. The foundation became more than just a project. It was a living testament to the power of kindness and the ripple effect of one person's compassion. I saw how a single act of generosity could change the course of someone's life, and how, in giving, I received so much more in return. I watched as Aunt May flourished in our new home, her laughter filling the rooms, her wisdom guiding not just me, but the many volunteers and friends who became part of our extended family. There were still challenges, of course. There were days when old doubts crept in, when I wondered if I was doing enough, or if I deserved the happiness I had found. But those moments grew fewer as I learned to trust myself, to believe that I was worthy of love and belonging, not because of what I could provide, but simply because I existed. I realized that the greatest freedom was not in having money, but in having the courage to live authentically, to choose my own path, and to honor my own needs. Now, when I look back on everything, the loneliness, the disappointments, the secret I carried, the choices I made, I feel nothing but gratitude. I am grateful for the lessons, for the heartbreaks, for the moments of doubt that forced me to grow. I am grateful for Aunt May, for her unwavering support and gentle wisdom, for showing me what unconditional love truly means. I am grateful, too, for the chance to help others quietly, to be a source of hope for those who feel forgotten. I have learned that true wealth is not measured in dollars or possessions, but in the quality of our relationships, in the kindness we offer, in the peace we find within ourselves. I have learned that family is not always defined by blood, but by the people who stand by you when you have nothing left to give. As the sun sets over the city and the world grows quiet, I am at peace. I know that I am enough, just as I am. I know that my story, like so many others, is not about the money, but about the freedom to choose, to forgive, to love, and to live with an open heart. That, I believe, is the greatest prize of all.